It's starting to appear as though Canadian real estate has peaked, with the Canadian Real Estate Association reporting that for the first time in quite some time, the average national housing price was slightly less than the month prior. Yes, March's average house price in Canada was lower than it was in February. And on this news, we are seeing different organizations start to reorganize their predictions for 2022. Although some of them are going up and some of them are going down, which is kind of interesting because it goes to show that at this point, it's really anybody's guess. But in today's video, we're going to discuss what different economists are predicting for the Canadian real estate market and just how bad it is getting and how bad it could get with more interest rate increases. But before we get into it, do me that favor, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell, and please hit that like button so more people like you can see this video. And don't forget about our race to 25,000 subscribers, where we're gonna give away $5,000 to one lucky subscriber. But in order to win, you have to be subscribed. And I highly recommend you turn on that notification bell because we're gonna show you exactly how to win that $5,000 on this channel when we hit 25,000. So go ahead, make sure you stay tuned and make sure that you're subscribed so that you can enter. Okay, so obviously today we're going to talk about how the Canadian real estate market has finally peaked, and it does indeed look like it has peaked, at least in most markets. But before we get into that, I need to address the elephant in the room, or at least the elephant in YouTube. That's right, there's been one YouTuber that has continually called me out and continues to call me out in his videos. His most recent video had a segment that was very much attacking me. And, you know, as you'll see from the clip I'm about to show you, he really did attack me.
And because nobody out there in the Canadian YouTube real estate world has nearly as much influence as I do.
Now, this is Surrey realtor Steve Koresh. He's obviously calling me out in this video and suggesting that he is the biggest YouTube influencer in real estate in Canada. Obviously, that is just simply not the case. It is very, very, very clear if you've been following the Canadian real estate space at all, that it is not Steve Koresh who is the #1 real estate influencer in Canada on YouTube. It is quite obviously Tom Story. Yes, that's right. You heard it here first. Tom Story, in my opinion, is the most influential real estate YouTuber in the country. And Steve is just nothing in comparison to Tom. And, you know, I appreciate that he calls me out in this video, but the reality of it is there are far more influential people than Steve. Now, that being said, I really don't want to take anything out of context because that's the problem when you pull clips of other people's videos and you don't provide the full video. It creates a scenario where context is absolutely stripped out of the whole thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to link to Steve's video in the description below where he calls me out, and you can judge for yourself whether it's him or Tom Story who's the most influential real estate YouTuber in Canada. Okay, so all that said, let's get into the actual video here. Let's talk about the fact that the Canadian real estate market, it appears, may have peaked. And I'm going to jump you into the headlines here, just like we always do, and start with this headline. This is from BNN Bloomberg. RBC calls spring peak for Canadian housing, sees prices falling in 2023. Now, this is an interesting article. This is Royal Bank of Canada Chief Economist Robert Hogue calling for the peak in the Canadian housing market in the spring of this year. Now, he's suggesting that housing prices will still continue to be up on a year-over-year level and up by the end of 2022, but he is predicting that housing prices should start to fall in 2023. Now, the only reason why he's predicting that housing prices will probably still be up in 2022 is because of this huge run-up that we had in the first couple months of this year, and that is going to have an overall effect on the market for the entirety of the year, because obviously we are starting at some pretty significant gains, and any reductions that happen over the next few months probably aren't going to be enough to pull back the market into negative territory. Now, one thing to note here, as I mentioned in the opening, according to the Canadian Real Estate Association, the average non-seasonally adjusted home price was $796,000 in March, up 11.2% from the year before. However, that was a moderation from the record $816,720 from a month before. So in other words, February. So what we are seeing is we've seen housing prices run up, run up, run up. They hit a peak in February, and then they came back down in March. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that housing prices are going to continue to drop, because 1 month doesn't mean there's going to be a trend. We saw this in the inflation data in December, where inflation data started to seem like it was going to come down, and then obviously it didn't. We'll make a video on that tomorrow that you can tune into. But overall, what Hogue is suggesting here is that in the face of rising interest rates, we're going to see some pushback in the market. Now, What we know, and this has been brought up across several YouTube channels lately, and I'm going to clarify it here for you real quick. What we know about interest rates is this, is for every 1% interest rate increase, we see a 10% headwind in the real estate market, or headwind for prices. And this is largely to do with qualification and how qualification works, because if you have a 1% increase in interest rates, there's about a 10% reduction in buying power. All you have to do to see this for yourself is go to a mortgage calculator like the one that's always linked in the description below, go to the pre-qualification amounts, increase the interest rates by 1% that you have to qualify at, and what you'll see is it reduces your qualification amount by about 10%. So as we start to see the Bank of Canada increase interest rates further, we saw a Scotiabank economist today call for a 1% hike in June, which I think is a little bit too much, but we'll probably expect a 0.5% hike in June. And therefore, those interest rate increases will have some headwind to the Canadian real estate market, which means it's not unreasonable for economists to predict that the height of the market is going to be in the spring, because these higher interest rates will have an effect on real estate prices. It appears that just the prospect of higher interest rates has already had an effect. We've seen this with reduced sales, and we've seen this with lower prices from February to March. So as those interest rate increases start to come up even more, we should start to see less activity in the real estate market, and therefore probably lower prices into the future. Now, on the topic of hot housing prices early in the year, Royal LePage has raised its 2022 home price forecast despite the slowdown in sales. This is largely, again, due to the fact that they didn't account for the extreme run-up in prices in early February that happened, and therefore they're factoring that into their predictions. They are still assuming that their predictions for later in the year are going to remain somewhat accurate. And in their most recent home price update, they pulled out a few numbers here. BNN did a great job of pulling out these numbers. This was not me, this was BNN. And it shows the forecast, the home price year over year change forecast for different markets across Canada. Obviously, they're seeing Toronto being up about 16.5% from last year, Vancouver being up 15%, Ottawa being up 13%, Montreal being up 12.5%, as well as Halifax, and then Calgary and Edmonton being at 8 and 9 respectively, and Regina and Winnipeg being up 7 and 8%. Now, my guess is that these numbers in the Calgary market and the Edmonton market are actually going to be a little bit higher. The reason for that is the significant amount of Ontario and British Columbia buyers that are buying investment properties here. By the way, there was another economic report here in the last couple of weeks that suggested that 41% of houses in Canada are owned by people who own multiple properties, which I thought was really interesting data. But for the most part, what we're seeing here is we're seeing RBC suggests that housing prices are going to cool off in the fall. We're seeing Royal LePage suggest that maybe that isn't so much the case, but that they had to revise their numbers up because of what happened with respect to the hot first quarter. And the reality of it is this, is we really don't know what's going to happen in the future for real estate. Obviously, it still feels like there's supply issues. It still feels like there's demand issues, and it still feels like there's upward pressure. However, what we're starting to see is we're starting to see people slow down on their buying. We're starting to see people slow down on their mortgage applications. And this is largely due to the higher interest rates that are coming. And it will largely be interest rates that determine exactly how much the housing market has to fight to keep on record pace. Because as different economists have suggested, and as is obvious, is as we see higher interest rates, that's going to squeeze the amount of buying power that people have, whether from a qualification standpoint or whether from just a number of dollars in pockets to spend standpoint. And if inflation continues to rise and so on and so forth, basically at some point, the market is going to have to come back down to where the buyers are if they're starting to feel squeezed for cash. Now, if there's some hidden excess amount of money in the economy or higher wages come around, that may not necessarily be the case. If you remember Economics 101, there's this term called ceteris paribus, which means all else being equal. So while we could see interest rates rise, that doesn't mean that we're necessarily going to see housing prices fall if other factors start to play on the market that encourage it to go up again, or there's reduced supply, or there's more immigrants coming to the country, or so on and so forth. So there's a lot of things that could happen here. What I wouldn't expect is I wouldn't expect that there will be a ton of people buying houses at significantly lower prices in the future. And the other thing you have to remember, if you are a home buyer, let's say you were able to purchase a home next year for 5% lower than you can buy it right now. but you end up having to pay 1% higher on your interest rate. Well, in effect, and you can run an amortization schedule on this and you can figure this out for yourself and see for yourself, but in effect, if you got a 5% discount on the price, but you paid 1% higher, you're actually paying in total 5% more for the house than you would have if you had bought a year earlier at a lower interest rate. So trying to time the market and hit lower prices isn't necessarily a good idea, especially if you are getting a mortgage and interest rates go up by 1 or 2%. Because if interest rates go up by 2%, then you're paying 20% more for that house, and so on and so forth. So you really have to pay attention to the total numbers, not just the short-term prices. So what that means is when you're looking at houses and you think, okay, I'm going to wait a year because I might get a deal. Well, before you wait a year thinking that you might get a deal, try to figure out how much you think housing prices are going to go down. And then run an amortization schedule based on how much you think you are going to have to pay for a house in a year, and then run it at an interest rate that's 1% higher, and then 2% higher, and then 3% higher. And what you'll see is the interest rate quite often will have a bigger impact on the price of the house and how much you ultimately pay for the house than what the actual reduction in prices would be if the reduction in prices actually happen, because there is no guarantee there. Now, for those of you who are data nerds here, I do want to take you through the monthly CREA stats because there's some interesting data here. Let's start with national home sales. You see, as of March, home sales are down 5.38% from the month before, which means we sold significantly less houses in March than we did in February. You can see that home sales in February and March are down quite substantially compared to last year, with significantly fewer sales in both of these months. And we're down about 16% from the record last year in March. This was the record number of sales ever sold in Canada. We're down about 16.35% from that. Newly listed homes are down 5.5% from February, and obviously down substantially from last year as well. And if we're taking a look at the national average sales price, what you can see is we're up 11% from last year, but we're down from February. This is where that drop off is from February of this year to March of this year. So down slightly, but still up substantially from last year. And this is why RBC, even though they're expecting a slowdown in the fall, is still saying that we aren't going to hit negative price territory. It's because this first quarter, January, February, saw such a huge price gain from the previous year that in order for us to get down into negative territory, the market would have to correct quite substantially. Now, as we always do, I'm going to take you through the national price map real quickly. This shows year over year pricing. So what a house in March sold for this year compared to last year. We're going to start by going west to east this time, starting in the Yukon with the average price up there going up from $497 to $538. Northwest Territories home prices in March of 2021 were $438,000. In 2022, $359,000. So something interesting going on there, especially considering that last month this number was significantly higher. What I'm going to guess is that there was a low number of transactions in the Northwest Territories, and because of the low number of transactions, these numbers get skewed a little bit. As I suggested last month, I thought that the numbers for the Northwest Territories were quite high. So what can happen is there's a small amount of transactions, and therefore that alters the numbers quite substantially compared to markets like BC, Alberta, and Ontario, where you have a significant number of transactions, and therefore, as a result, more even data over the course of a couple of months or a couple of years. British Columbia saw their average home price go up to $1,089,000. Alberta went up to $472,000 from $441,000 last year, so about a $30,000 price gain there. I suspect that this number is going to end up substantially higher by the end of the year, just because Alberta is a little bit behind the rest of the country and also experiencing the beginnings of another oil boom. Saskatchewan is up to $289,000 from $280,000 last year. Manitoba is up to $380,000 from $338,000 last year. Ontario is up to $1,052,000, up from $889,000 in March of 2021. By the way, one thing to note here is housing prices in Canada since February of 2020 are up about 50% overall. So that is a massive jump, largely due to Ontario and British Columbia. In Quebec, we're seeing housing prices go up to $499,000 from $435,000. In Newfoundland and Labrador, we're at $324,000, up from $288,000. In New Brunswick, we're up to $300,000 from $225,000. That is a very substantial jump. That is huge. Moving into Nova Scotia, we're at 390,000, up from 284,000. And last but not least, PEI is up to 328,000, up from 260,000. And I do believe that for the first time ever, I got every single province. Or did I miss one? I don't know. I think I got all those eastern provinces this time. Nonetheless, that is your monthly real estate update for April of 2022. If you found this video useful, do me that favor, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell. Please hit that like button so more people like you can see this video. Don't forget about that race to 25,000 subscribers, and we'll see you on the very next one. Cheers.